The morning sun always hit the eastern fields first. That particular September morning, the golden light filtered through the ancient oak trees that had witnessed 4 generations of my family work this land. My grandfather purchased these 15 acres in 1943, and it had been passed down ever since. Our modest 2-story farmhouse needed a fresh coat of paint, but the wraparound porch where I drank my coffee each morning remained my favorite spot in the world. The property stretched out before me, vegetable gardens to the south, the small apple orchard my father had planted in the 70s to the west, and the eastern fields where I grew hay and kept a few horses. The railroad tracks running along the eastern edge had been there longer than our ownership, a quiet boundary that rarely saw more than 2 slow-moving trains per week. Those tracks had never been a problem in all our years. I took another sip of coffee and watched a rabbit dart between rows in the vegetable garden. The tranquility was something city folks paid good money to experience for a weekend, but I had it every day. The land was not just property to me. It was my heritage, my daily bread, and my future retirement plan all wrapped into one deed. The development across the tracks was barely a year old. Where once stood pine forest now sat 96 identical houses with perfectly manicured lawns, each one barely 10 feet from the next. Meadow Creek Estates, they called it. I remembered the construction, the constant noise for 18 months, the dust that would drift over to coat my porch. But once completed, things had settled into a tolerable coexistence. I had met some of the new residents casually. Most seemed pleasant enough, young families and retirees looking for affordable homes with a semi-rural feel. They would wave when driving past, and occasionally stop to buy fresh eggs or produce from my small roadside stand. The homeowners association had formed immediately after construction finished. I received their welcome newsletter in my mailbox despite not being part of their community. I read it and recycled it without much thought. My daily routine remained unchanged despite my new neighbors. I would wake at dawn, tend to the horses, work in the garden or fields until lunch, and then focus on whatever seasonal tasks needed attention. In autumn, this meant preparing for winter, chopping wood for the stove, winterizing the chicken coop, and making repairs to outbuildings. That afternoon, I noticed unusual activity along the property line. 2 men in polo shirts with the Meadow Creek Estates logo were walking along the railroad tracks, occasionally stopping to take photographs and make notes. When they saw me watching, they quickly moved away. I thought little of it at the time. The railroad had occasional maintenance workers check the tracks, though these men did not look like railroad employees. I returned to splitting logs, the rhythmic thunk of the axe familiar and satisfying. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the land, I spotted flashlights moving along the same area. Something about their furtive movements made me uneasy. I watched from my darkened porch as they pointed toward my eastern fields, their voices too distant to make out words but their gestures animated and purposeful. For the first time since the development had been built, I felt a creeping sense of unease. Something was happening at the boundary of our properties. An instinct told me it would not be good news for my peaceful existence. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. A pristine white envelope with the Meadow Creek Estates logo embossed in gold in the corner. I opened it while standing at my mailbox, expecting perhaps a community announcement or invitation. Instead, I found a formal complaint about the unsightly conditions of my property visible from Meadow Creek homes. The letter specifically mentioned my equipment shed, the compost pile, and the irregular maintenance of vegetation along the railroad track boundary. I read it twice, baffled by both the content and the audacity. My family had maintained this property the same way for decades. The railroad tracks had always served as a clear boundary between properties. I had no legal obligation to the HOA whatsoever. 3 days later, a second letter arrived, this one more strongly worded, stating that I was in violation of community standards and demanding compliance within 14 days. It included a copy of HOA bylaws that I was supposedly subject to. The implications were absurd. I was not a member of their association, had never signed any agreement, and owned my property long before their development existed. That weekend, I drove to the county record's office. The clerk helped me access my property documents, boundary surveys, and the original railroad easement agreements from the 1920s. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My property was entirely separate from Meadow Creek Estates. The railroad tracks marked a clear legal boundary, and I had zero obligation to follow their community rules. Armed with copies of these documents, I decided to address the situation directly. I called the number listed on the HOA letterhead and requested a meeting with the president. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting across from Patricia Winters in the Meadow Creek Community Center. She was perhaps 50, with an expensive haircut and a perpetual expression suggesting she had just smelled something unpleasant. "Ms. Winters, I have brought documentation showing that my property is separate from Meadow Creek Estates. I am not subject to your HOA regulations," I explained, sliding the folder across the table. She barely glanced at the papers. "These documents are outdated. The development company acquired additional rights when Meadow Creek was constructed. Your property creates a visual nuisance for our residents, affecting their home values." "That is simply not true. My land has been in my family for generations, long before your development existed." Patricia smiled tightly. "Perhaps you do not understand modern property law. The HOA has authority to enforce standards for all properties that impact our community visual aesthetic. We can pursue legal remedies if necessary." She pushed my documents back across the table untouched. "I suggest compliance rather than conflict, for everyone's benefit." I left the meeting stunned by her dismissal and apparent delusion about her authority. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation deteriorated. My mailbox was suddenly filled with violation notices. Several Meadow Creek residents began photographing my property from the edge of the railroad tracks. Twice, I found HOA violation stickers placed on my fence posts and equipment. Then came the surveying equipment. One morning I discovered survey stakes with orange flags placed along the railroad boundary. When I approached the surveyors to ask questions, they claimed they were working for the railroad company and could not discuss their purpose. Something about their evasiveness felt wrong. I began documenting everything, taking photographs of the survey stakes, keeping copies of all HOA letters, and noting dates and times of any unusual activity. My neighbor Ed, whose property adjoined mine on the north side, warned me to be vigilant. "Those HOA types are ruthless," he said. "They tried similar tactics with the Johnson farm last year, before you moved back to take over the family place." The situation reached its breaking point exactly 1 month after the first letter. I woke to the sound of heavy machinery and the vibration of my house slightly shaking. Looking out my bedroom window, I saw railroad workers and equipment. By the time I dressed and ran outside, 6 massive railroad cars were being strategically positioned along the tracks directly adjacent to my eastern fields. The railroad cars created a solid wall of steel, completely blocking access to nearly 5 acres of my property. I stood there in shock as Patricia Winters emerged from her SUV parked on the development side. She walked toward me with that same tight smile. "The railroad company has graciously agreed to store these cars here indefinitely," she announced. "They make such a lovely visual barrier between our properties, do they not? Much better than looking at your unkempt fields. I could barely form words through my anger. This is illegal. You cannot block access to my property. The railroad has every right to use their tracks as they see fit, she replied coolly. If this arrangement happens to benefit our community aesthetic, that is merely a happy coincidence. She turned to leave, then looked back. You could always sell, you know. The development company has expressed interest in acquiring your land for Phase 2, something to consider. As she drove away, I stood before the wall of steel rail cars, the reality sinking in. This was not about community standards or property values. This was a calculated attempt to force me out, to acquire my family land for development. I placed my hand against the cold metal of the nearest railcar, feeling utterly powerless against what appeared to be a well-orchestrated scheme involving people with far more resources and connections than I possessed. The wall of steel railcars transformed my daily life instantly. What was once a 15-minute walk to check my eastern fields now required a 40-minute drive around the entire development to access my own property from a service road on the far side. My horses, normally pastured in those eastern fields during autumn, had to be relocated to the smaller paddock near the barn. The hayfield beyond the rail cars would go unharvested this season unless I found a solution. The first week after the blockade, I made 17 phone calls to the railroad company. Each call ended the same way: transfers between departments, promises of returned calls that ever came, and ultimately dead ends. The customer service representatives claimed the rail siding had been designated for indefinite storage, and that all proper procedures had been followed. None could tell me who had authorized the placement or when the cars might be moved. "Sir, these are standard storage procedures," one representative said flatly. "The company has every right to utilize trackage for equipment storage as needed." I photographed the rail cars from every angle, documenting their position and the way they completely sealed off access to my eastern property. The nearest car was positioned just inches from my property line, creating not just a visual barrier but a physical impossibility of passage. This felt deliberate, calculated even. The turning point came during an unexpected conversation at the local hardware store. I was purchasing fence repair supplies when I overheated two men discussing the railroad blockade. "Patricia pulled quite a coup getting those cars positioned there," one said. "Her brother-in-law at the railroad really came through." I froze, pretending to examine galvanized nails while straining to hear more. "How long do they plan to keep them there?" the other asked. "Long enough to make the old farm guy sell. The development company already has plans drawn up for Phase 2, 30 more houses where those fields are now." That night, rain pounded against my windows as I spread documents across my kitchen table. I researched Patricia Winters, discovering her husband Robert worked as a regional manager for Northeast Rail, the company that owned the tracks. The connection was obvious now. This was not random railroad storage, but a coordinated effort to cut me off from my own land. The next morning, I drove to the far side of my property and hiked in from the service road. It took nearly an hour of difficult trekking, but I needed to see the condition of my fields. When I arrived, I discovered survey stakes placed well within my property line, at least 15 feet beyond the railroad easement. Someone had been trespassing and preparing for something more permanent than railroad car storage. I began strategic conversations with neighbors living in Meadow Creek Estates. Most avoided eye contact when I mentioned the HOA, but a few were forthcoming. James Chen, who lived on the perimeter closest to my property, invited me in for coffee one afternoon. "Look, I bought here because the homes were affordable and had nice views of your fields," he admitted. I never supported this crusade against your property. Several of us voted against it at the last meeting. There was an actual vote about blocking my land, I asked, stunned at the brazenness. James nodded uncomfortably. They called it securing the community boundary, but everyone knew what they meant. About 40% of homeowners opposed it, but Patricia and her board pushed it through anyway. Over the following weeks, I connected with other sympathetic Meadow Creek residents. Gradually, a picture emerged of an HOA run by a small group of insiders with personal financial interests in acquiring my land. Patricia's husband Robert had financial ties to the development company, and two other board members worked in real estate development. The emotional toll mounted daily. I lost sleep, constantly worrying about losing my family heritage. Some mornings I would stand at the edge of the railroad tracks, staring at the wall of steel separating me from my own fields, feeling a combination of rage and helplessness that left me physically exhausted. I needed evidence, documentation, anything that would give me leverage against what increasingly seemed like a conspiracy. I began spending evenings at the county records office, researching property laws, railroad easements, and HOA regulations. The clerk, an older woman named Marge who had known my grandfather, took pity on my increasingly desperate searches. "Have you checked the original railroad easement agreements?" she asked one evening as closing time approached. "Those old documents sometimes have unusual restrictions or requirements." The next day, Marge led me to the basement archives where the oldest county records were stored. There, in a dusty file box labeled Railroad Rights-of-Way 1910-1930, I found it. The original easement agreement for the tracks bordering my property, dated 1923. My hands trembled as I read the yellowed document. The railroad had been granted a limited easement for track placement and maintenance only, with specific prohibitions against using the easement to block access to adjacent properties. More importantly, any modification to the easement terms required written consent from all adjoining property owners. There it was, the single signature that would change everything. My grandfather's signature appeared on the original document, establishing that any changes to the use of that railroad easement required written consent from my family. No such consent had ever been requested or granted for the storage of railcars. I carefully photographed every page of the document, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and cautious hope. This was not just a neighborly dispute anymore. This was a clear violation of legally binding easement terms. As I drove home that evening, the rain finally stopped, and a strip of clear sky appeared on the horizon, the first break in the clouds in weeks. The law office of Harriet Chen occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian home in the county seat. After calling every property rights attorney within 50 miles, Ms. Chen was the only one who agreed to see me immediately after hearing the basics of my situation. Her office walls displayed diplomas from prestigious universities, alongside photographs of rural landscapes, a combination that instantly put me at ease. "So they blocked access to 5 acres of your property using railroad cars, and you believe the HOA orchestrated this despite having no jurisdiction over your land," she summarized after I explained my situation. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes reflected intense focus. I spread my documentation across her desk: property deeds, boundary surveys, the HOA letters, and photographs of the railroad car blockade. Last, I carefully placed the copies of the 1923 easement agreement before her. The railroad easement specifically prohibits blocking property access, and requires written consent from adjoining landowners for any modification of use, I explained, pointing to the relevant paragraphs. My grandfather signed this original agreement, and I never consented to any changes. Ms. Chen read the document carefully, occasionally making notes. When she looked up, there was a new intensity in her expression. "This is significant," she said, tapping the easement agreement. "The railroad is in clear violation of the original terms. More importantly, if the HOA conspired with railroad officials to intentionally block your property access, we are looking at potential civil rights violations." Over the next 3 hours, Ms. Chen examined every document I had collected. She occasionally made phone calls to colleagues, speaking in legal terminology I barely understood. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and addressed me directly. "What the HOA and railroad have done appears not just petty but potentially illegal on multiple fronts. The easement violation is clear. If we can prove collusion between HOA officials and the railroad to deprive you of property access, that constitutes a serious civil matter." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. "So we can force them to move the rail cars." "That and potentially more," she replied. "I want to investigate the HOA itself. Something about this situation suggests they may be operating beyond their legal authority in other ways as well." Over the next 2 weeks, Ms. Chen and her paralegal conducted a thorough investigation of Meadow Creek Estates HOA. We filed formal complaints with the railroad company and requested all documentation related to the storage decision through legal channels. The railroad suddenly became much more responsive when communications arrived on legal letterhead. The breakthrough came when Ms. Chen obtained the HOA's original incorporation documents and bylaws through a subpoena. As we reviewed them together in her office, her expression changed from concentration to disbelief. "This is extraordinary," she said, spreading several documents across the conference table. "The Meadow Creek Estates HOA was improperly formed from the beginning. They failed to file critical documents with the state regulatory agency. Their bylaws contain provisions that exceed statutory authority under state law. And most importantly, their boundary claims in these documents do not match their actual legal property lines." She pointed to a map attached to the HOA incorporation papers. "They included your property within their claimed jurisdiction on their official filings, despite having no legal right to do so. This is not just administrative error. This appears deliberate." "What does that mean for my situation?" I asked, struggling to understand the legal implications. "It means the HOA as currently constructed may be operating illegally," she explained. "Their attempts to enforce rules on your property are completely baseless, but more importantly, their entire organizational structure may be invalid under state law." The following day, we discovered the linchpin, the one signature referenced in the document title. Among the HOA formation documents was a boundary agreement that required signatures from all adjacent property owners confirming the HOA boundaries. This document contained a forged signature purporting to be from my grandfather, who had been deceased for 5 years when the document was supposedly signed. Ms. Chen's eyes widened when she asked, "This is forgery, a criminal offense. Someone falsified your grandfather's signature to make it appear that your property consented to their boundary determinations." I stared at the signature, a poor imitation of my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "They forged his signature to steal my land." "It appears so," she confirmed. "And this changes everything. We now have evidence of potentially criminal activity in the HOA formation itself." We spent the remainder of the day preparing legal strategy. Ms. Chen outlined two possible approaches: seek an immediate injunction to remove the railcars and restore my property access, or pursue a more comprehensive case, challenging the HOA's legal existence based on fraudulent formation. The injunction would solve your immediate problem, she explained, but challenging the HOA's legal existence could prevent this from happening again and potentially dissolve their authority completely. The decision was clear to me. This had gone beyond a simple boundary dispute. The HOA had orchestrated a complex scheme involving forgery, trespassing, and collusion with the railroad to deprive me of my property rights. A temporary solution was not enough. I want to challenge their legal existence, I told Ms. Chen firmly. This needs to stop permanently. She nodded, a hint of admiration in her expression. It will be more complex and take longer, but I believe we have grounds for success. We will need to prepare meticulously and gather additional evidence from other homeowners. As I left her office that afternoon, I felt a profound shift. For weeks, I had felt powerless against forces seemingly beyond my control. Now, document by document, we had uncovered a pattern of deception that would be their undoing. The balance of power had shifted, though Patricia Winters and her HOA board remained blissfully unaware of the legal storm about to break over their heads. The legal strategy Ms. Chen developed required patience and secrecy. If the HOA board discovers our investigation before we are ready, they will attempt to correct their paperwork retroactively, she warned. We need to document everything thoroughly before filing. I agreed, understanding that this approach meant living with the railroad blockade for additional weeks while we built our case. Each morning, I still looked out at the wall of steel cutting me off from my eastern fields, but the sight now filled me with determination rather than despair. Our first task was gathering affidavits from Meadow Creek residents who disagreed with the HOA actions. James Chen introduced me to others who had opposed the boundary security measures at HOA meetings. We met discreetly, at the local diner, in my living room, or at Ms. Chen's office after hours. They never listened to homeowner concerns, explained Diana Rodriguez, who had lived in Meadow Creek for 8 months. I questioned the railroad car plan at the April meeting and was told that community security decisions were not subject to general vote. Patricia told me directly that homeowners who opposed board decisions should consider living elsewhere, added Michael Tucci, another resident. When I pointed out that the bylaws required homeowner votes on major expenditures, my speaking privileges were revoked for that meeting. Ms. Chen carefully documented each testimony, building a pattern of procedural violations and overreach by the HOA board. Meanwhile, I continued my research at the county records office, tracing property boundaries and easement histories. 4 weeks into our investigation, we scheduled meetings with county officials. The county clerk's office confirmed that several required HOA filings were missing or improperly completed. The tax assessor's office verified that the HOA had been claiming jurisdiction over property parcels, including portions of mine, that were not legally within their boundaries. This happens more often than people realize, admitted Frank Patterson, the county assessor. HOAs sometimes try to extend their authority beyond their legal boundaries, but this case is exceptional in its boldness. As our evidence mounted, Ms. Chen discovered additional violations. The HOA had failed to maintain required financial reserves, had improperly allocated funds without homeowner approval, and had never registered with the State Homeowners Association Regulatory Board as legally required. Each violation alone might result in fines or corrective orders, Ms. Chen explained. Collectively, they constitute grounds for potential dissolution of the organization under state law. We worked methodically, organizing documentation into categories: boundary violations, procedural violations, financial improprieties, and evidence of deliberate fraud. The forgery of my grandfather's signature remained our strongest piece of evidence, as it demonstrated willful intent rather than administrative oversight. During this process, my emotional state transformed. Where I had once felt victimized and powerless, I now experienced a growing sense of purpose and eventual justice. I stood straighter, slept better, and approached each day with renewed energy. The wall of railcars remained, but they no longer symbolized defeat. They represented the physical evidence of overreach that would ultimately bring down those responsible. The weather seemed to mirror this transformation. After weeks of unseasonable rain and gloom, clear autumn days returned. The morning sun once again bathed my property in golden light, though shadows from the railcars still cut sharply across my eastern fields. 8 weeks after our investigation began, Ms. Chen called me to her office for a final review before filing. The conference table was covered with organized stacks of documents, each folder color-coded and labeled. "We have documented 27 distinct violations of state HOA regulations," she explained, pointing to the blue folders. 7 instances of procedural violations within their own bylaws, she continued, indicating the green folders. And most significantly, 3 potential criminal violations including the forgery, misappropriation of funds, and filing false documents with county offices. She turned to face me directly. "We are ready to file. Once we do, events will move quickly. The court will issue notices, the HOA will be required to respond, and a hearing date will be set. Are you prepared for what comes next?" I thought of my grandfather, who had worked this land with his hands for decades. I thought of the betrayal represented by his forged signature. I thought of Patricia Winters and her smug certainty that money and connections would allow her to take what did not belong to her. "I am ready," I affirmed. "File everything." That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset cast long shadows from the wall of railcars. In the distance, lights came on in the Meadow Creek Community Center, where the monthly HOA meeting was taking place. Patricia Winters would be standing at the podium, confidently discussing community matters, utterly unaware that in less than 24 hours, court officers would be delivering documents that threatened the very existence of her kingdom. I sealed a large envelope containing copies of everything we had filed with the court. Tomorrow, I would mail it to every homeowner in Meadow Creek Estates, ensuring complete transparency about their HOA's activities. The calm I felt was not just resignation or acceptance. It was the quiet confidence of knowing that justice, though slow, was finally approaching. The legal notices were delivered to HOA board members on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from Patricia Winters, which I declined on advice from Ms. Chen. By Tuesday evening, an emergency HOA meeting had been announced via text message and email to all Meadow Creek residents. "Remember, you are not required to respond to them directly," Ms. Chen reminded me when I called her about the meeting announcement. "Let the legal process work as designed." I had already mailed my information packets to all homeowners. Many would receive them before the emergency meeting, ensuring they would be well informed about the allegations against their HOA leadership. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Meadow Creek Community Center. Although not a resident, I had legal standing to attend as an affected party named in the court filings. Ms. Chen advised me to bring a recording device and remain silent unless directly addressed by the board. When I arrived, the community center parking lot was full. Inside, the normally orderly rows of chairs had been hastily arranged to accommodate an overflow crowd. Residents stood along walls and sat on windowsills. The atmosphere vibrated with tension and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered. Patricia Winters stood at the podium mid-sentence and froze when she saw me. For a fleeting moment, her composure cracked, revealing shock and something close to fear before she regained her practiced smile. "As I was saying," she continued, "these frivolous legal claims are simply an attempt to extort money from our community fund. Our attorney assures us they have no merit whatsoever." I took a seat in the back row, placing my voice recorder on my knee as instructed by Ms. Chen. Several homeowners turned to look at me, some with curiosity, others with unexpected nods of acknowledgement. My information packets had clearly reached their destinations. "The board has unanimously voted to fight these baseless accusations," Patricia continued. "We may need to implement a special assessment to cover legal expenses, but we are confident of prevailing." From the middle of the room, a hand raised. It belonged to James Chen. "Madam President, many of us received concerning information today about HOA formation irregularities and potential fraud. Could you specifically address the allegation that the HOA boundaries were falsified in official documents?" Patricia's smile tightened. "I am not aware of any legitimate concerns about our boundaries. Next question, please." Another resident stood without being recognized. "The documents show a signature from someone who had been deceased for 5 years when it was supposedly signed. How do you explain that?" The room erupted in multiple conversations. Patricia tapped her gavel repeatedly, attempting to restore order. "These are complex legal matters that cannot be properly addressed in this format. The board will issue a formal response through proper channels." "What about the railroad cars blocking access to adjacent property?" called another voice. "The packets show correspondence between you and Northeast Rail, arranging for those cars to be placed specifically to obstruct access." Patricia's face flushed. "That is an outrageous misrepresentation of routine communications about community security measures." For nearly an hour, residents continued raising questions directly from my information packet. Patricia and the board members deflected, dismissed, or simply refused to answer most inquiries. The meeting devolved into barely controlled chaos, with several homeowners demanding immediate board resignations. Finally, Patricia abruptly adjourned the meeting. "This discussion is clearly unproductive. The board will consult with legal counsel and provide updates through official channels only." As people filed out, many stopped to speak with me briefly. Some apologized for the HOA's actions. Others shared additional information about questionable board decisions. The momentum had shifted dramatically in a single evening. 3 weeks later, we appeared before Judge Harold Brennan in the county courthouse. The HOA had hired an expensive law firm from the city, their 3 attorneys in costly suits creating a stark contrast with Ms. Chen in her modest business attire. Patricia Winters and the entire board sat behind their legal team, expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility when they glanced my way. Judge Brennan was thorough and methodical, reviewing each allegation in detail. When he reached the forged signature, he looked directly at Patricia Winters. "The court takes allegations of document forgery extremely seriously," he stated, "especially when used to falsely claim jurisdiction over property." The HOA's lead attorney attempted to dismiss the signature as an administrative error. Your Honor, if there were any irregularities in documentation, they were unintentional clerical mistakes that can be easily remedied. Judge Brennan removed his glasses. Counsel, a deceased person's signature appearing on a document years after their death goes well beyond clerical error. For 4 hours, the judge reviewed evidence, questioned both legal teams, and occasionally made extensive notes. Finally, he straightened the papers before him and delivered his ruling. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was improperly formed, has operated beyond its legal authority, and has engaged in actions that constitute a pattern of abuse of power and potential fraud. He continued, his voice firm and clear. The court hereby orders the immediate dissolution of the Meadow Creek Estates Homeowners Association as currently constituted. All actions taken by the association against non-member properties are declared null and void. The railroad cars placed along the boundary must be removed within 72 hours. Patricia Winters gasped audibly. Her attorney immediately began arguing for a stay of the order, which Judge Brennan denied. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court refers the matter of the falsified signature to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation. The gavel struck with finality. In that moment, the weight that had pressed upon me for months lifted completely. I shook Ms. Chen's hand, thanking her for her brilliant legal work, and walked from the courtroom without looking back at Patricia Winters or the board members. 3 days later, I stood at my property line watching as railroad workers removed the wall of steel that had blocked my eastern fields for nearly 4 months. The massive cars were coupled to a locomotive and slowly pulled away, revealing my land once again. As the last car cleared the property line, sunlight flooded across the fields unobstructed for the first time since summer. From the Meadow Creek side, I noticed several residents watching the removal. Among them was Patricia Winters, arms crossed, face taut with defeat as she observed the dismantling of her final attempt to force me out. When she saw me watching, she quickly turned and walked away, her posture rigid with unspent anger. I walked across my eastern fields that afternoon, inspecting for damage and planning the spring planting. The land was resilient. It would recover quickly now that access was restored, as would I. The first for sale sign appeared in Meadow Creek Estates 3 days after the court ruling. Within 2 weeks, 8 more properties were listed for sale, primarily homes belonging to former HOA board members and their closest allies. Patricia and Robert Winters put their house on the market without a public announcement and moved out in the middle of a weeknight, leaving neighbors to discover their departure after the fact. The dissolution of the HOA created immediate practical challenges for the community. Questions arose about maintenance of common areas, the community center operations, and what would happen to funds in the HOA accounts. The court appointed a receiver to manage the financial transition and distribution of remaining funds to homeowners. On a sunny Saturday morning about 2 weeks after the court decision, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find James Chen and 5 other Meadow Creek residents standing on my porch. "We wanted to apologize personally," James said. "Many of us had no idea what the board was doing in our names. The way they treated you and your property was inexcusable." Another resident, an older woman named Margaret, stepped forward. "We also wanted to thank you. That HOA was becoming increasingly authoritarian. The board fined people for ridiculous violations and treated homeowners like children. You freed us as much as yourself." I invited them in for coffee, and our conversation turned to the future of the neighborhood. Without an HOA, residents worried about maintaining property values and addressing legitimate community needs. "We still need some basic agreements," James explained, "but nothing like what existed before." Over the following weeks, informal meetings began taking place in living rooms throughout Meadow Creek. I was invited to several, where residents discussed creating a voluntary community association with minimal rules focused only on maintaining common areas and organizing occasional neighborhood events. "The difference is choice," explained Diana Rodriguez during one such meeting. "Participation would be voluntary, rules would be minimal, and leadership would rotate annually to prevent power concentration." When they asked for my input, I shared my grandfather's philosophy about neighboring. "Good fences make good neighbors, but so does respecting boundaries and communicating directly about concerns." The new Meadow Creek Community Association formed 2 months later. Its charter explicitly limited authority to common areas only, required 75% resident approval for any rule changes, and